silence or violence, clients in conflict, because most people think when there's an argument, you really only have two options. Either you don't say anything or you get very angry. And part of that is about how we're hardwired and the sort of physical and chemical reactions we have when we think of conflict. And we all actually know, particularly coaches, you know how to manage stress. We know what we should do in conflict situations, and we know what our clients should do. But often we do exactly the wrong things. And then afterwards we calm down, we think, bloody hell, how stupid was that? So the good news is, and there's been a lot of research on this, that people can actually be taught how to control those instinctive anger or fear reactions. And once you learn those, why you react the way you react, you can either prevent yourself getting into that situation, or you can bring yourself back down from anger or fear. And as clients get into those situations, they often don't listen to us, and you lose. If you're advising particularly business clients, you can have the situation where there's two clients who are arguing because one wants to do what you're there to, say you're developing the business, and the other one wants to keep the business as it is. So what they do is they start arguing, they stop listening to you, and one blames you for making the other one want to change. And then often you'll lose the business, or it all goes wrong and you get blamed because it's easier than blaming the partner. So it's helpful to understand a bit of conflict, whatever kind of coaching you're in. So I'll start with a little bit about me. I'm a mediator, coach, and facilitator, and I have a particular interest in making life easier for people by passing on what I've learned. And I quite like making myself redundant, which is kind of sad, but that's it what it is. So let's look at why people aren't sensible, and why even nice, reasonable people get into situations where they say and do things that horrifies them later on. And it's part of a physical hardwired response that when we feel threatened, unsure, or surprised, our initial instinctive response is fight, flight, or freeze. And understanding how conflict grows and what makes us react that way helps us with our own conflicts, but it also helps us to, when we want to advise clients. Whoops, getting a bit excited there. So the conflict cycle really starts with differences, and differences can be differences in taste, differences in cultures, differences in values, interests. One person might want to grow a business, one person might want to take the money out of the business. Personalities, some people are very outgoing, other people are very withdrawn. Differences in status or power, differences in resources and access to them. And differences in themselves are not necessarily a cause of conflict, but they can be the start of the conflict. And differences which aren't respected, valued, or understood can result in really serious conflict. And often it's over something as simple as whether people like tea or coffee. So just look at that and see how that can potentially become quite a source. So the difference, maybe I like tea, you like coffee. And the disagreement happens when you sort of start saying, well, coffee's much better than tea. And I'm going, no, actually, I think tea is much better than coffee. Now, as long as neither of us try and affect the other's enjoyment, we're fine. So we can disagree and we can agree to disagree. What happens when it becomes a problem is, for example, if you said, well, actually, because most of the people here like coffee, we're not going to have tea. So that's causing me a problem. it becomes a dispute when I start saying, no, hang on, that's not fair. I'm paying into the tea. So if you're not going to provide tea, I'm not going to pay in for the milk or anything else. And then it causes a problem for both of us, and that becomes a dispute. A conflict then happens when we feel our goals are incompatible, and instead of discussing it reasonably and saying, well, look what we can do, it's like, I'm not going to do anything to help you. I'm getting really quite cross, and I'm going to win this battle. And it's about me winning so that everybody has tea and nobody has coffee. And you sort of lose sight about what the conflict's about. It's about those horrible people who drink coffee or those horrible people who drink tea. And it can actually escalate to violence, not necessarily physical violence, but when people try and damage, hurt, or exploit resources, they're sort of saying, oh, well, those people down that said we should have that coffee, they're really just a bunch of control, horrible people. And then the final stage is when the parties seek to destroy each other's power source, and they've completely forgotten it's about tea or coffee. It's, those three over there, they're just trying to take over the department. They're not really very nice people. And you know what I caught them doing? And it really spirals completely out of control. And the further up the conflict cycle you go, the harder it is to rein people back because they aren't thinking straight. And so why is it that people lose sight of this? It's something that actually I'm sure you've all experienced in workplace, at home, where you suddenly find you're not arguing about what you started arguing about, you're arguing about how you argue. So before we move on, let's just look at the costs of conflict. It's obvious relationships suffer when there's conflict, but workplaces where conflict's not handled well, whether it's either allowed to become verbal and violent or it's suppressed, are much more dangerous because people are frightened to speak out about dangerous situations because people yell back at them. And so they think, well, I know he's doing something dangerous. I'm not going to say anything because last time I said something, he just shouted at me. So it's also shown, research has shown that for every conflict ignored or handled badly, a day of time a week is lost. When I first heard that, I thought, that just sounds totally unrealistic. But then I started thinking of some of the places where I worked where people moaned over coffee. They spent time whinging to other people. They spent time not working because they were so busy looking for something to find fault with the other person for. They weren't doing their job properly because, for example, in one shop it was, well, she doesn't get up every time the customer comes in, so why should I? I'll just wait. And so then your customer service starts going down, which of course costs you money. Actually, suppressing your anger can cause mental and physical complaints, but so can continually confronting people where you just have adrenaline surges, you get ulcers, and you end up possibly in fights. Or disagreements and disputes can put a brick wall in the way of progress. He wants it, even if it's sensible, I'm not going to agree to it. So the cost of conflict's not just to your clients, it can also impact on your business and your relationship with the clients. So why aren't we more sensible? Why do we do the wrong thing, even when we really, really need to get it right and know what we should do? So it's partly because in terms of evolution, our brain is quite young and we're still hardwired for that caveman inside us. So when we see something like that, people tend to react in fear or draw back instinctively. Because in evolution, when in the jungle you saw something lying in the path that might have been a snake or it might have been a stick, before you really even thought about it, you saw it as a threat and you would either freeze, run away, or club it to death. And so our brains are still hardwired to do that. When there's a change, we usually see it as a threat because that's the safest way to see it. Yeah? Because nobody, if you say for a snake, you see that if you sort of went, I wonder what that is, and got your nose a little too close, you would be dead. So the people who had that inquiring mind died and didn't pass on their genes. But generally, in physically dangerous situations, having a negative bias is much safer. But in mentally dangerous situations, a negative bias causes you to not see the potential good side and react in a negative way, which with two people who are reacting negatively, the conflict soon escalates. So just look at a very simple thing about what happens in our brain. Basically, with every event that happens, sometimes we're not aware of it, but it triggers a thought. So someone ignores you in the street, and you might think, oh, they're really stressed. And you don't react badly. You just think, oh, he's stressed, so what? He's ignored me. Or you might think, what's he ignoring me? Oh, do you know, I bet it's because I said something to him yesterday. And then your reaction's quite different. And one of the things that's useful to remember is that between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. And you can choose what your thoughts are, and that influences your reaction. Now, what stops us doing that is because human brains, this is a very simplified picture of the brain. But if you think of it, pink part of your brain is mainly to keep you alive by regulating your temperature, your heart rate, your hormones, and all living organisms have this, and it keeps functioning even when you're unconscious. If it stops functioning, you die, or you're only being kept alive by machines. The middle orangey bit is what's been around for a long time. It's sometimes known as the chimp brain or the reptile brain or the primate brain. Its role is really a protection role. And that's where the instincts like fear, anger, maternal instincts, all the protective reactions are there. And the big blue bit is the thinking bit, where wisdom, confidence, analyzing, that's what makes us human. Now, what happens when we see something that frightens us is our heart rate starts to speed up. When that happens, it sends out a signal which switches off the blood from non-essential activities like thinking to the big muscles. It switches off the flow to the digestion and switches the blood supply to your big muscles so that you can run away. You're often stronger. Sends out adrenaline and cortisone. Adrenaline gives you more energy, speeds your heart rate up even more. And cortisone makes you see focus, so it narrows your focus and makes you see all the potential dangers. So you can imagine in a physically dangerous situation, this is a really useful response, because you just react quickly. You don't have to think about it. It just happens. But what happens is we can't think straight. We can only see the danger. And in a situation where you're talking to someone else who's also seeing everything as an attack, the likelihood of starting a downward spiral into conflict is very, very high because both people become increasingly irrational and less likely to adapt or act reasonably. And a lot of people will talk about this as a brain hijack or a red mist coming down where you get really angry. You don't feel confident because your body's being pumped full of hormones that make you angry, anxious, alert to all sorts of dangers. And your focus narrows to the particular issue. You become obsessed with this conflict or the danger, and you can't see the bigger picture. So what you really need to do is take control. And you need to be able to control that fight or flight response really before that thinking switched off, or be able to bring yourself back. And it's possible, and this is the kind of stuff that they teach the emergency services, that they teach, SAS. And research has shown some people are naturally good at it because of their personalities. They're able to calm themselves down, or they may have been taught by watching their parents. And they're often the people who practice at it the most. But there's a particular group of researchers called, they do a lot of work called crucial conversations, crucial accountability. They've done research into how people influence other people. And they went into a lot of factories and offices and watched people who were very good at taking a conversation which was starting to go nuclear and bringing it back down. And they looked at what the people did, and then they created some rules about how you bring conversations back and control them. And so that you can talk to just about anything, talk about just about anything to just about anyone with safety and good results, and not getting in a paddy. So I'm just going to go over a few of the tips. I mean, there's an awful lot to the thing. But before we go on, are there any questions on the bit I've done? I mean, I've kind of flown through it fairly fast.
It wasn't really a question. It was something. I'm reading a book at the moment called from Dr. John Bifford, A Great Day at the Office. Sorry about this. And what it talks about in there is about evolution. If you look at it, evolution is 365 days of a year, where the last he was talking really about diet and food. And if you actually look at the last, perhaps since Christ was born, or so I think the last few hundred years, really that's one day it's the 31st of December. If you're looking at the evolution model.
Yeah.
It was a good way of explaining, if you look at 365 days, where we are on the evolution model is the 31st of December.
Yeah.
And that's really what you're saying there about, about how we're hardwired up.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're interested in sort of more information on that, there's a book called The Chimp Paradox, which I don't agree with everything he says, but he explains it quite clearly. But there's a lot of research. So the book that I think is absolutely brilliant is called Crucial Conversations. And that's by, hang on, I have got it here. So it's by Patterson, Grenny, Macmillan, and Schwitzler. And they do a lot of behavioral science videos and experiments. And I think their website's called Vital Skills. And they have a very useful newsletter, which is, they have a different topic. So it's kind of like, how can I talk to my son about his smoking habits without him getting really angry? How can I tell my interfering mother-in-law not to interfere? Or, how can I deal with a colleague at work who's continually criticizing me? So it's very, very practical, their stuff, and based on a lot of research. So the strategies I thought we'd just look at is how to catch conflict early at the thought stage, and how to adjust your reaction and how to help people go from the oh blankety blank blank to okay, which psychiatrist Mark Goulden, who wrote a book called Just Listen, he says that the faster we learn to go through the stages, the better we'll be at controlling our tempers. So let's get started. I love this quote from Viktor Frankl, which is, between stimulus and response, there's space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And if you can get in the habit, and I think it's easier with small events, get in the habit of when something happens and you feel angry, just pausing and thinking, what is it that makes me angry? What am I telling myself about this event that makes me angry? So if you think of something just now that irritates you, yeah, if you were in the room with me, I have a machine called Heart Math, which is a biofeedback thing. And it measures your heart rate. And you can actually see when you start getting irritated, you can see how your heart rate speeds up. And not only does it speed up, but it becomes very jaggy. And if you sit for a moment and take several deep, slow breaths, you know, like your granny used to take, say, deep breaths, calm down, count to 10. There's actually a lot of science in that, because taking a deep breath and letting it out for longer than you take it in. So if you breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4 and breathe out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that triggers your vagus nerve, which is another instinct, which is your flight, or calms you. So it's called the calm and control response. And the other thing that strengthens it, Barbara Friedrichsen, who wrote a book, she's written several books, but she studied positive emotions, and she's written Positivity and Love 2.0. And she was interested in, you know, what's the point of positive emotions? Negative emotions protect us, but what do positive emotions do? So they did some experiments where they showed people, they told people they had to speak in public, which makes most people feel anxious, and they measured them on this heart rate thing. And so they saw their heart rate going all spiky and faster. And then they showed them a film, which was just kind of a documentary. They showed another group a film which was a war film. They showed another group a film which was funny. And they showed another group a film which was very sweet and light and cheerful. And they discovered that the people who watched the happy film or the funny film, actually their heart rate went back to normal faster than the people who watched a documentary or who didn't watch any film. And the people who watched the conflict, it took longer, even though they weren't involved in the conflict, it took longer for their heart rate to get back to normal. So they said that if you can remind yourself of positive emotions, whether it's pride or gratitude, at a time when you're feeling stressed or anxious or unhappy or frightened, it also triggers that calm and control, switches your brain back on again. So the combination of those two things will work quite swiftly to bring you back into switching on your thinking brain. Obviously, you have to catch yourself before the red mist comes down. Yeah. So if you practice with small things before you're really angry about something, and you're sensible enough to think, I'm not thinking straight, step back a minute, take a couple of deep breaths. So obviously, if the situation's not safe, if someone's chasing you around the room with an axe, then let your fight and flight, and get out of there. But sometimes it's just that pause when you take the time to calm yourself, to look at, is this really what's happening? Or am I telling myself something that isn't true? You know, is there another reason for someone behaving that way? So finding the reason is, if you ask yourself, why would a reasonable person behave that way? That will often make you start calming down. You know, if somebody yells at you and you think, well, why would a reasonable person behave that way? Maybe it's just the last straw for them. Maybe I'm doing something dangerous. Maybe they just yell at everybody. So then you see it, you're not so angry about it, you can think more clearly. And maybe what are they gaining by their behavior? Most people's behavior has a positive reason behind it. People, unless they're completely crazy, but most people are doing something because of the way they think. So if you can kind of working out that, sorry, we've gone. And what am I not admitting about my role? You know, have I done something that would make people angry? If someone did what I've just done, would I have been angry? So we tend to see, when we get mad, we have this hero, victim, villain, and we're always either the victim or the hero, and the other person's always the villain. And in mediation, you know, I talk to both sides. And the interesting thing is you'll talk to one side, and what they say seems incredibly reasonable and logical because that's how they see the world. Yeah. And the other guys are the bad guys. And then you talk to the other guys and you think, oh, you know what? They're not such bad guys after all. And they say, oh, those people over there, you know, what they've told you is complete lies. And usually there's a third side. And it's worth reminding ourselves of this when we're in conflict and trying to kind of say, what can I change? Yeah. So it's adjusting your view. So saying, okay, what I really want, when I'm talking to people before I go into mediation, I ask them, you know, tell me your side of the story. And what do you really, really want to get out of this conflict? Yeah. And for example, if it's a parent, they might be very angry about the way they care, their primary care person was looking after the child. And they would really like that person to be sacked. But what they really, really want more than anything else is for their child to get the care they need. And so I say, okay, so what do you do to get the care you need for your child? What's going to be the best way of doing that? And I don't tell them, they will almost automatically say, well, if I blame the care worker and start talking about all the bad things they did, their manager will get very defensive. And so I would say then, well, what do you need to do now to get a good result? And usually what you need to do is take some of the emotion and the blame out of what you're saying. And also maybe say to them, you know, maybe I didn't make myself clear. Offer some kind of, what can I do to make the situation better, rather than expecting all the adjustment from the other side. Because there's very few situations where there isn't something that one side can do. There are some situations, yeah, but most of the time, the only behavior we can really influence is our own. So we have to kind of look at it. What can I do to make them more likely to do what I want? That's the only real way we can influence other people's behavior. And what we see when we're in conflict, I don't know if you can see that slide where just here, this one. That's often what people see. They'll see a headless person. But if you look deeper or from further away, you can see that it's not a headless person because you're looking at it from a different distance. So how can we get our clients to calm down? By just saying to them, well, what you're seeing is wrong, will only make them more angry, right? it's what we all tend to, well, don't get in such a state. There's a bigger picture. When people are really stressed or upset, they will jump to a negative conclusion, and being told that they are wrong only makes them more angry with you. And I think husbands find this with wives. The wives come in and, I'm so upset with this. And the husband will say, well, it shouldn't be upset. It's just, just ignore her. And then the wife gets more angry. And why we're getting angry is, so you don't even appreciate, I'm not even allowed to be angry now, And so when someone is jumping to negative conclusions and is based on little information, how can we get them to calm down? And I talk about, oh, come on. Oh. There we go. Taking them from beast to Buddha. And what you have to do is, before you start telling people that they are wrong, you have to listen to them. Yeah. And I will spend an hour sometimes on the phone going, yeah, well, that must have been hard for you. Right. So how did that make you feel? And until a client feels really listened to, they will not hear anything you say to them. Yeah. And whatever you say to them will just make them angrier. And the interesting thing I find is that when I get into that situation with a client, I'm fine. When I get into that situation with my husband, I react completely differently because the emotions kick in. Yeah. So you have to be able to kind of step back a bit and pause. So you need to listen to the pain and give them plenty of time to vent. Don't contradict. And in mediation, we call that the vent thing. And then they feel exhausted. Don't rush in with a conversation, with a solution yet. Just say, and what else? Tell me more about how you felt. Tell me about what you think needs to happen to make this situation right. And sometimes you don't have to provide any solution, because they will either tell you a bit more about the problem, which, you think, oh, I'm glad I didn't suggest that solution because that wouldn't have worked. But they will start to see, because they feel listened to, they'll start listening to themselves, and they will hear some of the contradictions, and they will hear some of the problems. And Goulston talks about 5 phases that you take people, that we go through when we're mad. And he says if you try and stop any of those phases, the person will keep returning to the anger. And that's why you find hostage negotiators start with empathizing with the person. And you have to be careful that you don't, say, oh yeah, they're terrible people. Yeah, you should go out and shoot them. But sort of empathizing with their feeling, with their reaction, helping them feel heard, and letting them release all the anger. It's kind of like a boil or something. If you let them release that anger, and then recenter, what do you need to do? What do you need to make it right? And then say, okay, so if that's what you need to make it right, what can you do to take a step nearer that? I know that, it'd be nice if the other people did that, but we can't actually influence them. What can you do to make yourself feel better or to bring about some change? And then you can re-engage with you would either bring the people together, or you would perhaps say, okay, so now that you've sorted all of that out, where do you want to go? And then you go into the coaching phase. And I think it's very easy to kind of rush in and say, well, don't worry about that. That's just a completely wrong picture. So that's it. Any questions?
Nancy, thank you. That was really interesting. I recently ran a workshop on stress and stress management, and there's obviously a lot of synergy between kind of anger management and stress. And the bit that there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of discuss a bit more actually. The first thing is when you were talking about the stages of conflicts, and when people lose sight of their goal. That's a really interesting point, isn't it? It sort of starts to become about winning the argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's about the subject matter sitting behind it.
Because
how do you find that kind of manifests itself in discussions in your mediation?
in mediation, it's usually when people are more upset about something than they would be. So for example, it's kind of like, well, and they